to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
Urban Fae Trekking Through Mundania Part 2 by BearLair64. I made it back in time for the late morning planning session. The usual suspects had returned. Our greatest concern was that Serpente would strike before we could act. That was why I wanted to get him back ASAP. We were as fortified as we could be. Frankly, I expected a hit at any moment, and wondered why some flying, living firebomb hadn't already laid waste to the care. Starkvarm won't attack until he has to. Dragons can be aggressive. Some types may be easily aroused to fury. This kind of certainty is one of those breeds. Yet it mostly tends to be lazy. It's the reason why they haven't taken over everything, Tyree informed the table. He may be working with Serpente at the moment, but fire drakes are jealous of their independence, and even more than their hordes. After a brief pause, he continued, "It was interesting the other night when Serpente kept referring to my Kelpie. Had the Kelpie overheard that? There had been an interesting confrontation. They may be employed, but they are not owned by any save the highest powers and above. And then only to the extent that any being is owned by its creators. Serpente is highly placed on his father's side, but I was surprised to hear him use that language. He's become arrogant indeed, or confident. If he treats the dragon as a servant, the way he refers to a Kelpie, he may solve the problem he presents on his own." I smiled at the happy thought of roasted reptilian avian anthro hybrid. We know that Starkvarm's castle is far removed from either realm, but there's a shortcut through the portal at the top of the building in the medical center. Can portals be destroyed or sealed? I'd not studied that part of Portalology 101. Grandfather nodded. Indeed they can. They may even be shifted to new places or between destinations. However, it is beyond what even true Fae are capable. Only a small portion of high Fae can undertake such measures. It's easy to create a temporary portal or gateway than to tamper with the true portal. That said, there are advantages to their otherwise immutable nature. It means they are consistent and can be warded or even blocked from either or both. I knew by then that the temporary portals were how the high Fae I'd met managed that swirling disappearance thing. I was keen to learn it for my own purposes, but Grandfather warned me against trying things that were beyond my current kenning, without proper master or mistress to guide me. We spoke on and discussed various options for our next foray against the enemy and his forces. Our Mundanian team were mostly out of commission, but we decided that I would be a very good ambassador to visit the old hood and determine what might be salvaged. So I set off for BAE View to visit my old pal Sony, if he was still alive. If not, I would subvert whoever had taken his place and schedule a visit to his grave. I took Gairn and the chariot team, and my 3 remaining wolf guards. I invited Roar and the Fawn Squad, who'd become my personal guard, along with the wolves. I wanted a large entourage and figured maybe it was time for a scouting raid. We ended up taking the small party of dwarves as well. I learned from their leader, Svarthand, that his folk never allow non-dwarves to learn their true names. But this one fits. His left hand was burned black from some long-ago incident on which he did not elaborate. I didn't care. He'd shown himself to be tough and resourceful. That was more important to our goals than how he got his everyday name. I was on the chariot, so my troops needed mounts as well. The gnomon rode wee, round-bellied mounts that seemed part Shetland pony and part unicorn goat. Ponycorns, I suppose. Regular unicorns were hard to come by, and oftentimes hostile towards anthros, with good reason. These little fellows, though, were quite friendly and very careful where they aimed their horns. The fawns kept the easy pace on the hoof, despite being bipedal. It was in their nature to trot. The dwarves used war carts drawn by all manner of draft beasts. Swarthans was pulled by an enormous boar, with metal sheaths on its tusk, and a too friendly disposition that could be hazardous to the objects of his affections. We set out for a certain dark realm that included a terrible swamp populated by ghastly creatures. Having a large force suddenly seemed like a good idea. The portal we sought was the same used by the Lamia who killed Mercedes. It led out into the drainage sewers, but we'd be able to portage the chariot through it and up onto the street. There was a dumpster door, similar to the ones near Serpentay's mundane pyramid, situated near our destination. Those larger openings were simply Fae-built exits that worked like Fae baggage. They allowed for more volume than was apparent to the eye to pass through in a train. First we had to negotiate the morass in the dark realm. The stench was bad enough. The biting and blood-sucking insects were all but intolerable. The hisses and croaks and grunts of the wildlife were hideous. Then the shark frogs attacked. I wish it was a joke, but a swarm of football-sized frogs came leaping at us, their rows of teeth like so many sharks, dripping with venom. Why does everything in Otherworld have to be poisonous? I asked myself, even as I battled down another of the manacle amphibioids. They tended to splatter when struck with a heavy object. It was nasty, of course, and their innards and the globules, thereof, that splattered, gave off malodorous reek. They were a danger, yet it was almost funny to see how easily and willingly they died. Maybe if I was a frog with venomous rows of shark's teeth who lived in a dank and smelly mire, I'd be suicidal as well. In the end, we had to dose all of the party with Onsgedabil. I had finally picked up my own never-emptied flask of the stuff. The venom was minor, but painful if not addressed, and the bites tended to get infected, at least for the long-lived. We were tired and smelly when we arrived at the portal and found a guardian in place. "Good evening, my Lord Wolf." My old Lambia chick friend greeted me. She bowed, and I returned the gesture. "I see you are back to form. I'm happy for you, but your injunctions against returning to Mundania is still in place," I informed her. She was a formidable opponent in her big Lamia form, but I had confidence in the size and capabilities of my personal team. We were as large as any gang crew I'd encountered in the old days, and I'd already defeated her on my own, and with the grace of Fortuna smiling. "I have no desires in that direction, my Lord Wolf. I must still serve my master, but he has mostly forgotten me since your victory. So I am able to do something I like. I like warding portals, and since no other being wants this one, I felt it would be proper penance until you release me. I owe you my life, so I will serve in this capacity until you say otherwise." I noted that she now referred to me twice as my Lord Wolf, so I believe she was sincere. If I win, and your master is finally defeated, What will become of you and his other servants?" She smiled in her gruesome serpent manner. "We would be free to determine our own causes, or to find new masters. At least until one of his siblings came along to claim the remnants." I smiled back with my wolf gape, just to be polite. "I understand that you are limited in how you might pay me, so I will merely ask you questions, and then ask you to let us pass in peace. If you answer me truthfully, then you will be free from any obligation to me." "You have already asked one question, my Lord Wolf. You have 2 remaining." I grinned in earnest. Typical Fae, always dealing in threes and trying to cheat. "Will you alert, or have you already alerted your master to our presence and use of the passage?" Her smile remained fixed. "I have not, but I will have to soon." I nodded in understanding. "Are there any traps or beings who would do us harm awaiting us in the immediate vicinity on the other side of this portal?" "I cannot know the motives of all, but none of my master's folk await you." "My thanks, milady. Once we are all through safely, you are free from any obligation you may feel towards me." She coiled backwards. "So easily? Most beings would exact much more in return. I have wronged you deeply, though it was on behalf of another." I shrugged. "I don't need any more, and I hope for you to be free of your obligations as soon as possible. You started as my nemesis, but I understand more fully now the requirements of obligation and vows. They can weigh heavily. You did no more damage than required by your master." She bowed again. I wasn't sure, but I may have made a new friend among the dark beings. One had to be cautious. Weakness, even in the form of mercy, was not considered a respectable quality among the Fae, especially the dark Fae. We completed the portage, and I rolled into the alley behind BAE View. In a glamoured limo, the fawns played the role of my immediate entourage this night. The rest remained back in the shadows and appeared to locals as a row of parked, uniform black SUVs with some additional chrome so as to not panic them, thinking they were the po-po rides. I used an old song by a rock group with 2 guys who wore beards that were absurdly long, an inspiration to develop the glamour for my clothing and general appearance. It went over well enough. I was indeed a sharp-dressed man, like the blinged-up version of James Bond. R.I.P. Dusty Hill. I approached the back door where 2 unfamiliar goons were posted. "Sony here?" They glanced nervously at one another, and then a silent contest of wills ensued to determine which of them would be stuck responding to my inquiry. The one to my left finally lost and spoke. "Sony in the hospital. Don't look good." I frowned to show that the information was new to me. "Which hospital?" They resumed their contest, but I interrupted. "Look, Sony and I went to war with Serpente's bunch. We kicked some arse. When it was all said and done, I had to take my crew elsewhere to do some more damage. Now I'm here to pay my respects to my friend. Who's in the house?" The question was determined who had taken over the decimated organization. Lefty lost again and said, "James is running things till we know something." I'd met James. He was not much older than me, some kind of relative to Sony, maybe even one of his kids. It was comforting to know that the business was still within such a reputable family. Nah, can't do it. Even as an internal joke, reprobate family. Yeah, that's more apropos. I nodded thanks and strolled on in as if I was the new owner. When I entered the office, I saw that James had assumed the throne. Sony's ridiculous broad-winged office chair with the too thick padding and squeaky pleather covering. The young lion himself was seated and looked a little frazzled, despite the cool mane of his well-groomed, short fro. My reputation had grown, and he knew that I ran a dangerous and large crew these days. But he didn't know where our territory was, or indeed how I'd made such a leap in prosperity and status. The fear and rumors were that I had started a traditional crime syndicate, and that's why I was having it out with Serpente, who had done the same. According to the whispers, we both wanted to be fake mafia dons. Silly, of course, but people love rumors. The more ridiculous and conspiracy theory-oriented, the better. On the other hand, there's always a grain of truth in a sheaf of gossip. James was young and cocky, but nonplussed by my sudden appearance. Hey, Red Wolf. Sony ain't here. He's still in the hospital. The time I'd spent in Otherworld after the raids had amounted to about a week in Mundania. First time I'd been free to check up on him. Dudes out back said he was in the big Shriner hospital, that right? Yeah, that's the one. He's in intensive care in the burn unit. Just got off life support, but, well, he's still pretty messed up, and he ain't exactly young. James gave me the whole spiel so that he wouldn't have to answer questions. He was playing the role with me that I'd once played with his boss. I liked him, though. He was sharper and better spoken than Sony, and while he was even nastier in some ways, he was competent at crime and leadership, and I respected that. If he was Sony's, yet I assume his abilities had mostly come from his mother. I nodded and assumed a grave expression. I'm going to go visit him, but I wanted to check here first and see that everything was in order while he was gone. I look out for my friends. The implication was that I did awful things to my enemies, but I was willing to see him as a probationary friend. No doubt he was familiar with probation. His mind and his life experiences, including the hurt he had inflicted as well as received, did my work for me. Sure, our crew took a bad hit. We think we did more damage than we got, but Serpente's got pretty massive gang, with cartel connections and everything. Bunch of military types from the south of the border, armed forces, all kinds of people and equipment and things. Not sure how long we can hold out, but he's been quiet. I think that hit at Central Park hurt him more than anything, and he had less soldiers. Maybe some other hit did that. I let the question hang in the fetid air. I was there to obtain information, not just share. James shrugged. His new drug was taking over that sweet sleep stuff. Bad news. No ODs or anything, but it takes hold like nothing I've ever seen. And the users get crazy or comatose. Mostly crazy, he finished, and stared into the middle distance in contemplation, possibly in bemusement that he had used the word comatose, but I thought better of him than that. I wished that he'd been in charge when this whole mess started. I gave a single, terse nod and partially answered his implied question about the other hit. We hit him hard, and they've done some damage in return. So far, we've done much more to them than they to us, but like you say, they have more numbers. We have momentum, and shortly we will have some nasty surprises for them. If you have anybody still around who's willing to take care of just a few little chores, nothing that will devastate the crew any further, it's strictly up to you. I left him in deep contemplation of the center of the too large desk, bedecked with silly executive toys from the 80s. For a murdering turd, he wasn't such a bad dude. In his view, the murders were in battle, and he had a reputation that he only shot up soldiers and was careful about where stray bullets went. I had to admire that in proper context. It certainly wasn't the norm among gangsters. It was time to visit my old friend at the burn hospital. James stood and prepared to walk with me. He was still unsure of his role, and no doubt wanted to be polite to potential allies. That's when the thumps, crumps, and staccato rattle of automatic fire began. Fubar had followed us through the swamp after all. I led the fawn squad to the back door and stopped to listen. Apparently the back door boys were fending off the attack more effectively than those out front, probably because of our gnomon and dwarven contingents and the fact that there were fewer angles of approach. I cautiously opened the door and peered out to see the gangsters running amok and firing dangerously in too many directions. I stepped out and barked orders. Stop! Stop shooting! A few stopped, and as the noise and chaos transformed into more useful stares and gapes in my direction, I called out again. Point at the ground until you have a target. We can't waste ammo. They have more. A few dim bulbs lit, and I motioned for the fawns to join us. I called over Garen in the chariots, and he rolled up next to the wall. I climbed aboard and then gave a boost to each of the fawns as they sprang up onto the roof of the building. They were lighter weight than I'd feared, and good, scratch that, amazing jumpers. They lined up along the front of the roof and rained down death on the attacking forces. My fawn squad leader, Piero, called down to me, even as I arranged a soiree with the gangsters and prepared my ground forces to tear around the corner. My lord, they have retreated back between the buildings. We've won the engagement. They fled in a rout. About the time I started to relax just a little, Svarthand called out, Fire Drake! Evidently dwarves had a sense about their arch-nemeses. Well, one of their arch-enemies. They had plenty of the lesser varieties. I called out to Piero to get fawns back to the ground level. In the meantime, I'd sent the rest of the team scrambling back down the alley. I brought up the rear in case any of the attackers got too bold. I saw that James Scooms, whom I'd ordered around so easily, were confused once again. Get down the street. Something big is coming. I pointed at one of them. Go around front and tell James the others to get out of the building. He bolted. I didn't know where. I had time only for my own troops, who'd made a splendid progress in our impromptu retreat. I directed them to turn to the first available corners. I had an idea what was about to happen. Just as it occurred, the lit area with a golden glow and heat chased us, even around the two bends we'd followed. I chanced to glance backwards and saw that the billowing inferno rising above the low rooftops. I was instantly transported back to the day my parents had perished in the same kind of fire. Starkvarm was in Mundania. Serpente had set a trap for me at Bayview. He likely wanted to finish off any mortal opponents, and probably had with the first breath of the fire drake. The dragon didn't stay long. We heard the thunderclap of his wings, and he faded into the night like so many sonic booms. However, Snafu had joined us. Possibly he had felt left out of the action. Our progress halted, and shouts arose from the front ranks. We were too compressed to roll forward effectively. We'd made our way back to the dumpster gate that led back through the sewers, to the portal, and to the dark and dank swamp realm. It was clear that something or things had followed us, and now attacked. I set the fawns up a nearby fire escape, and hopped down from the chariot to wade forward to face the threat. Guard the rear, I ordered Garen, and a handful of gnomon. The dwarves had made a line up front and were savagely slugging it out with a contingent of skunk goblins, like the ones we'd fought in Fulshire Tower. Behind those was a rank of 4 creatures that I later learned were called Grootslang, elephant-like but smaller, about half the size of an Asian elephant. They had 4 short tusks, green skin, and ram-like horns above flappy ears. Snaky spiked tails waved behind them. They were hideous, and I'm sure dangerous, but the things that rode them were nightmarish. They looked like the frog sharks, but all grown up and armored naturally like gators. These beings did not look like they would die easy, and they were intelligent enough to have fashioned weapons from bog iron. They wore thick leather hides around their middles to protect their presumably soft bellies. I made it to the front rank and hacked and slashed and choked a little on the skunk goblins' effluvium. They compliantly died for us, but when the last had fallen and their reek fouled the air, joined by the suaerial stench of their bodily fluids, it was us against the 4 Grootslang. Those creatures surged forward, their riders aiming long-bladed lances at those of us in the front rank. I feared that at least some of us would be skewered, but the 4 riders collapsed and slid from the backs of their mount. Each had 2 arrows protruding from the chest. The fawn squad had struck again. The mounts, however, did not stop just because their riders were dead. I soon found myself lifted bodily by tusks, curved horns, and a massive body, and slammed into the ranks behind me. They, in turn, tossed me back forward to rejoin the fray. I clambered up onto the back of the nearest Grootslang and slid to its backside. I had to lop off the lashing tail that attempted to sting me. The dwarves and gnomon would have stopped the bulky beasts. I wanted to get at the leader of the opposing party. I found myself alone behind the enemy front ranks. That couldn't turn without some coordination, so I would be able to face an opponent without immediate concern for what lay behind. I realized that with the Grootslangs between my team and me, I'd have to handle the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th ranks alone. These were fronted by Jaguar shock troops, the true, long-lived fanatics. No dressed-up hood rats in this deputization. Behind them were the snake-bird Quetzalcoathros from Serpente's realm, his rank-and-file soldiers there before me, in rank-and-file. The width of the alley allowed the big jaguar men to line up 5 abreast with room to fight. The soldiers managed 6 shoulder to shoulder and slightly offset so that 2 rankings could support another. Fubar and Snafu had joined forces. I was mad at myself more than at the enemy, but the anger welled quickly when a figure that towered above the rest appeared from behind the soldiers, laughed aloud. "Time to end the feud, grandson of the toothless old dog," Serpente shouted triumphantly from high on his mount. It was the first glimpse I'd caught of the Kelpie, the great monster that had slain my friend, Mr. Gosling. It initially appeared as a beautiful, light gray stallion, but then the fangs showed, and the mare rose like a fin. I later saw that its fetlocks were fins as well, and the colors on its legs darkened from gray to green, and near the bottom blue, like the colors in deep water. It was a frightening being, yet lovely all at once. All the way Fae in that regard. The Mactier Moor's exhaustive training saved my life. When I pursued the murdering fiend in his murdering fiend of a mount, a pair of the jaguar warriors struck. I barely fended off their assaults with my targe. I counter-struck one and broke his nose, but the paddle sword glanced off the rim, then rang against my helmet. With having seen the objects of my hatred and having been struck on the head, I slipped into the rage. The glorious battle joy, the red mist descended over my eyes. I know I roared and growled and howled. I know I struck, and that was all I knew for a while. My first glimmer of reason I experienced found me standing before 2 of my greatest enemies. The warriors and soldiers lay scattered and dead to a being. Most had wounds from my weapons, and some sported fawn squad arrows that waved above their dead and dying forms. I looked up at Serpente, and for the first time, I registered some doubt behind his arrogant eyes. The Kelpie stamped like a horse, and its murderous-looking talons struck sparks from the gravel that paved the alleyway. It was clearly not intimidated. It was a powerful being, and the broken arrows around its feet attested to the fact that most weapons could not harm it. A growl rose behind me, from many throats at once. My troops were still in the fight. Serpente gave a command, and the Kelpies reluctantly turned and took him back underground, and presumably through the portal. It took a while to get our little force past the bodies of the Grootslangs. The Fawn squad covered us from the rooftops nearby. The way back to Otherworld, by way of the swamp portal, was close to us, but could belch forth warriors and soldiers at any moment. The fire behind had spread to several other buildings, and Svarthand called out to the team, "The fire drake will soon return to make another pass." Fubar and Snafu were not enough. The Murphy himself had decided to show. "Follow me," I cried. I knew of another portal, perhaps friendly, hopefully far enough away to avoid Stark Farm's next pass. The Vaughns stayed aloft this time, and trailed along roof to roof where they could. Picado called down observations and advice on which streets and alleyways to take. We hadn't gone far when the alleyway near the dumpster gate exploded in flames, and the buildings between which so many bodies lay became an inferno. I guess that Serpente believed in cremation as opposed to burial. The entire block was ablaze. If Sony lived, he'd return to a pile of ashes. I hoped that James and his crew had gotten far enough away from the area to survive. We might still need them. Fortunately, the dragon chose to hunt the trails that led to the hospital. He had no way of knowing where I was actually taking my troops. He didn't stay on the prowl for very long anyway. When the feeble lights of mortal emergency vehicles approached the hateful glow of the fire, he veered off and was soon replaced by mundane helicopters and drones. I desperately hoped that the enemy would have no way to track us or determine our goal. I checked with Garen, and while he didn't know how to get there, he soundly agreed with the destination I ordered. Armilla and Hendrix were excited and wanted to leap ahead, but we had to stay together. The higher buildings eventually ran out, and the tops were too exposed to dragon fire, so the Fawn squad joined us on the ground. They attempted to scout ahead, but had to stay close enough to me to provide for directions. The wolf guards covered the sides and rear of the chariot, so I was able to concentrate on what I was doing and where I was leading my folk. I only hoped that we would be able to get the vehicle down the stairs and into the basement, assuming that there were stairs and not some glamour. Maybe Makcha and the big dogs would be there to greet us. We eventually rounded the last corner and were on the street with an old house that had the portal in the basement. It was dark and gloomy, as it had been when I left it last. There were no signs of life. I sent the gnomon in as scouts. They could see well in the darkness and had taken less damage than the dwarves had during the alley fight. The fawns encircled the outer perimeter and hunted for signs of hidden or approaching enemies. A bus passed by, and my thoughts returned to the night I'd unwittingly met my grandfather. 2 freaks had stalked me then, hunters. I wondered whether Serpente might employ such beings. Then the signal came, a brief glint, followed by 2 slower ones, from a spot different on the long front porch. My fears about accessing the portal were dissipated. There was an old single-car garage with a floor that led straight down to the area beneath the house. I had no idea where the portal led. I hadn't been through it, just on the threshold. Grandfather had told me to use it only in case of emergency, since it was not generally known. The gnomon of their own violation had scouted beyond it. Roar stood, looking grim-faced. "My Lord Wolf, we bear tragic tidings." Naturally, I thought the things had begun to look up, so why wouldn't there be tragic tidings? I remained silent and continued. The portal leads to Wolf Clan territory, near the King Alpha's den. The guardian pack lies slain on the other side. My wolf trio perked up at this. They'd likely known where the portal lay, but had no way to tell us. Instead, they'd sniffed around and whined and growled. Now, without a glance backwards, they all three leapt forward towards the other side. I led the rest of the party through. We set up a defensive perimeter on the inside until we bridged everyone through and had them safely ensconced behind cover and concealment. The area was heavily wooded, so the latter was a small matter. We surveyed the area beyond. We'd transitioned from night to mid-afternoon. About a week after we left, we had not stopped to focus on adjusting our arrival time to the degree we could. I took a moment to observe the scene and confer with the other leaders. The guardian pack had been 6 strong. Now the bodies of the slain wolves lay in a row and their heads were mounted on snapped-off tree limbs, each with the mouth gaped in a death mask grin. "Any idea who could have done this?" I asked the others. There were any number of capable beings, creatures, combinations in Otherworld. It was the wolves who found the clue. They'd sniffed out prints and other marks. The hunters among our band worked with the wolves and soon had a report covered by Piado. "My lord, it seems that a new contingent has entered the fray. These signs are all of Coyote, many creatures and several anthros of their kind and others, to include some of my own. This is an unusual development after the powers ordered that no other parties become involved in the feud." I smiled. I've often been reminded that our feud is a small matter, barely worth notice. Perhaps there is some other conflict afoot. This may have nothing to do with us. Of course, they could have volunteered to serve Serpente. Nothing prevents that. At least not yet. We had to leave the mystery for a moment. I assigned my wolves and several wolf clan anthros to guard the portal until the regular guardians arrived, or the Western Gaelic wolf sent new ones. We set off at once for the royal den. We had to get news and see what had happened in our absence. So quoth this raven, "My darlings, I hope you all have a marvelous weekend, and thank you to Michael Lockhart for this lovely and continued story." Thank you so kindly for stopping by my chateau, my darlings. It does mean so much to me. Please, if you have not subscribed, as many of you have not, please do so. Give me a like so I know what you would like to hear. And comment. I always love to read your comments. And special thanks to my Patreon and membership supporters. Ciao, darlings.